Hello to all of the real progressives out there. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I think we have a fantastic show for you as always. Want to start with those Real Progressives plugs. realprogressives.org to find all of our content, articles, podcasts, etc. Our Patreon is also there if you care to donate. Follow us on Twitter at RealProgressUS and at RP_in_action. If you want to follow me, I'm at Luke Parcher Show. Make sure that you don't miss out on any of the other platforms that we're on. We're also on Rockfin. We're on Twitch. We're on Discord. We have a TikTok. Go check out all of our content wherever you like to get your content. And again, realprogressives.org for any and all of the above. So we have a really interesting story here that I think is something that a lot of lefties could have told you about prior, but there's actually been a leak about this, right? So this is about the FBI and how their informant process actually ends up basically plotting crimes that otherwise may well have not been committed, and wastes millions of dollars on people who do absolutely nothing to, further justice or anything of the sort. The FBI, this was a big thing during the War on Terror, you guys. They would try to find people and essentially turn them on the United States. So they were basically creating the crime that these agencies purport to be fighting or opposing, right? They were creating the very kinds of terror incidents, creating the very kinds of extremism that they claim to be opposing, right? So we have a clip here that I'd like to show you guys. This is Breaking Points breaking down some of the details about this story, and then we'll come back and discuss.
We're getting a new window into just how extensive the government's use is of paid informants, and also just how many crimes
it's wild.
These taxpayer-funded informants are authorized to commit. Let's throw this Ken Vogel tweet up on the screen. This is actually from a report that was in Forbes. Federal agencies paid $294 million to confidential informants. That was from 2011 to 2018. The DEA paid an Amtrak employee $963,000, which the IG called a substantial waste of government funds. Oh, you think? In addition, this was maybe the part that was most stunning to me. The FBI authorized informants to commit 22,823 different crimes.
In just 4 years, between 2011 and 2014.
As part of their work. And I mean, this really gets to some of the questions that we've raised on this show about the overuse of informants, how oftentimes the incentive for the government and for these informants is to create crime that they can be involved then in quote unquote disrupting acts that may never have been plotted or executed on if you didn't have government agents involved every step of the way saying, hey, you should do this and let me help you and let me push you and why don't we make it a bigger plot? Why? Why are the incentives in place? First of all, sometimes these informants, they only get paid if they're out there, helping to foment crime. But in addition, from the government's perspective, a lot of times the actors involved, they get to have the big press conference, political careers are made over big high profile terror plot disruptions and those sorts of things. So their incentive also is to help foment plots that then they can, with much fanfare, disrupt. So the numbers here, ultimately, in just a few years, are pretty stunning to look at.
And what's funny is that because this is a non-political report, they point to the Gretchen Whitmer plot and January 6th as areas where we have seen government informants who have been authorized to commit crimes, or at the very least have not been charged because of their role in the actual crime itself, and then reporting it to the higher ups or possibly testifying, providing evidence, and all of that. So we know that in some cases, these people are confidential informants who are not getting paid. And in many cases, though, they're getting paid a lot, like a lot of money. An airline employee, $500,000. Amtrak, $1 million. DEA is paying an average $26,000 over a 5-year period, which, it's not that much money, but it's also not nothing. So you're seeing here hundreds of millions of dollars being spent on these informants and 22,000 crimes, which, once again, according to their law, it's actually kind of crazy. They're allowed to authorize people to commit crimes as long as they're reporting on other crimes. And look, I get it. It's complicated. Sometimes you need that. But There's not a lot of oversight here. The fact is that this didn't even come from an IG report. It came from a bunch of guys who had to go through the federal court system and compile as much of the data. The government hasn't released any of the data as recently. 22,000 crimes in 4 years. I mean, what's that on average? Something like, I mean, look, that's like 6,000 crimes a year, something like that. And maybe even higher in recent years. We don't know. There's no data that's really publicly available in terms of recent times. So this stuff is being done in our name. It's a real corruption of the Justice Department.
That is exactly right. They call them otherwise illegal acts, otherwise known as
a crime.
Crimes. Yeah, and to give you a sense of how much abuse there's been within this program, a court released, I'm reading from this report, a court released testimony of one confidential informant in Atlanta who received $212,000 from the DEA. DEA has so many of these informants, by the way, from 2011 to 2013. She testified she wasn't sure why she was paid. That was her testimony. She also testified to a sexual relationship with the DEA group supervisor who allegedly convinced the subordinates to falsify reports to justify those payments. That case currently under review by the Inspector General.
So it's one of those stories where the details kind of seem stunning, but it's, if you follow the FBI much, it's really not all that surprising. Really law enforcement as a whole. And we're going to get into some more police stories later today, but almost 30,000 crimes, you guys, just in the last handful of years. I think she said 28,000 some odd crimes in the last handful of years. They're plotting crimes to justify their own existence and to stoke fear. It all plays into this whole big picture game, if you will. They mentioned, I think, the Whitmer plot, Gretchen Whitmer, who she's governor of Michigan. There was a plot to kidnap her, right? Well, as it turned out, there were more FBI informants involved in that plot than there were defendants. So who actually came up with this? Who actually put this idea in these people's heads? Who actually created the whole scenario to start with, right? Very likely that plot doesn't occur if the FBI doesn't create it. Well, then they get to conveniently claim that they squashed it, justify their own existence, make themselves appear necessary, right? So it's self-preservation first and foremost. It's also it just feeds into all of the pro-cop propaganda, all of the fear mongering that is used to control populaces, etc. Right? You need this authority, or else everything will go to shit, is what they want everybody to believe all of the time. They want you in a constant state of fear. And the irony, of course, is that you should probably fear the FBI more than you fear the criminals that they claim to, keep in check. And on that note, I wanted to show you guys an article here. It's about Malcolm X, and unsurprisingly to many, the FBI's likely involvement. The two people who were actually long accused of killing Malcolm X have been exonerated. This is in Salon. Did the FBI order Malcolm X's murder? New revelations raise an old question. 2 innocent men have been exonerated, but Malcolm was surrounded by FBI informants on the day of his death. There's a lot suspicious about this, you guys. Just a few days before the city of New York removed the oversized statue of Thomas Jefferson from the city council chamber, Manhattan District Attorney Cyrus Vance asked a state court judge to vacate the convictions of 2 men who were wrongfully convicted for the murder of civil rights visionary Malcolm X in 1965 at the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem. While moving the statue may seem heavy lifting, it's nothing compared to the inner fortitude required to revisit the ongoing race-based injustices that victimize people of color who are living now and continue to feel the lash of punitive, racist, and often corrupt law enforcement. Exonerations of wrongfully convicted Black men now come with such frequency that they show up at the end of the newscast just before the weather and the stock quotes. There can be no greater validation of critical race theory than regularly tracking these cases in all their gory detail. Vance, who was in his final days in office, told the court that Muhammad Abdul Aziz, who is still living at age 83, and Khalil Islam, who died in 2009, had been the victims of unacceptable violations of the law and the public trust on a massive scale that easily crossed over the line into something far more sinister than your run-of-the-mill racial profiling. Quote, But what we have obtained now in this reinvestigation are numerous materials that my office tragically did not have in 1965 and thus did not turn over to the defense. Vance told the court, quote, most critically, we have obtained dozens and dozens of reports from the FBI and the NYPD's Bureau of Special Services and Investigations. And significantly, we now have reports revealing that on orders from Director J. Edgar Hoover himself, the FBI ordered multiple witnesses not to tell police or prosecutors that they were, in fact, FBI informants. Vance continued, quote, many of these documents were exculpatory. Many of them were disclosed. None of them were disclosed to the defense. Without these files, it is clear these men did not receive a fair trial and their convictions must be vacated. Moreover, under the unique circumstances presented by a 55-year-old case, there can be no retrial on any of the charges contained in the indictment. Therefore, the people believe the indictment against Mr. Aziz and Mr. Islam should be dismissed. So there's a lot to get into here. But there was already massive suspicion about the circumstances surrounding the murder of Malcolm X and the FBI's likely involvement and the NYPD's likely involvement. Malcolm had been targeted by numerous attempts on his life or plotted attempts on his life, and therefore he often had pretty substantial security, including local law enforcement, when he would be in public. This particular day, there was very little. And it turned out that some of the people who were thought to just be regular civilians surrounding him were actually FBI and NYPD informants. There's also the fact that one individual involved in Malcolm's death was immediately apprehended that day. We know he was involved, and he has consistently, since 65, how many years, he has said that the two men who were convicted of Malcolm's death had nothing to do with it. And he's even dropped names of others who were involved. And yet law enforcement and the Justice Department did fuck all about it. They did nothing. They let these two men rot away in prison for decades, knowing full well that the best piece of evidence that they had, the best piece of testimony they had, exonerated those men. And it just raises further suspicion that, in the sense that makes it seem all the more likely that those who actually were involved probably did have those connections, right? Because why else would this have been so covered up? If those were just random people that assassinated Malcolm X, there would be no pushback to getting it right. There would be no reason not to go get it right, right? But what they did is they covered this up, and I think that makes it seem awfully suspicious that the FBI and the New York police force were involved. And we all know how it's been extensively revealed the extent to which the FBI was already attempting to disrupt the civil rights movement at the time, including Nation of Islam and Malcolm X. They were trying to drive divisions between these groups, and this has all become public. They were doing undercover operations to try to separate and divide and keep the movement from gaining any sort of momentum or having any sort of strength. So it all lines right up with the way that we know the FBI behaves, the way that we know Hoover behaved, the way that we know the NYPD behaves. And it all lines up with the narratives at the time that the civil rights movement was being infiltrated by law enforcement, and that these attempts to cripple that movement were obviously openly ongoing. So the FBI, you guys, it really just needs to go. It's not any different from a local police force, in my view, in policy, in the sense that we need to abolish and replace those institutions with institutions that are actually designed to protect and serve the public instead of what we currently have. And obviously, police departments and the FBI do nothing of the sort. What they do is further oppress. They inflict violence upon poor and marginalized communities. They divide movements that are designed to liberate people, democratic movements, right? Pro-worker, pro-labor movements. One of their primary roles is to cripple the left effectively. And they just need to go. It's really, really that simple. They just need to go. Anyone who has taken just a few minutes to look into the history of the FBI, I think, would agree with me on that. And this story just kind of confirms those things that we already knew. that they're involved in more crime than they stop. You guys, they create these plots so that they can justify their own existence, and then they end up contributing to crime and violence, and destabilizing our society, dividing us up, all this kind of stuff. And the Malcolm X story also confirming what we already knew about the FBI, that they want nothing to do with these movements. In fact, they want to cripple them as best they possibly can. So do not trust the FBI, and we will keep an eye out on that Malcolm X story. 2 men basically gave their entire lives. I mean, one of them's out now, but he's in his 80s, right? So they gave their entire lives for nothing. The FBI took not only Malcolm's life, but these 2 men's life as well. So another critical story that I just have not seen receiving a whole heck of a lot of coverage is Ghislaine Maxwell's trial. Now, Ghislaine Maxwell, of course, was Epstein's right-hand woman, so to say, Jeff Epstein. This is in the Daily Beast. Could these Epstein insiders bring down Ghislaine Maxwell? More than a year after her arrest, the 59-year-old socialite is about to stand trial on charges she procured girls for Epstein's sex ring. Here's who could appear at trial. Now, I just want to be clear, you guys. Maxwell not only was a social benefit and boon for Jeffrey Epstein in the sense that her dad was quite wealthy and powerful, and she connected Epstein to a lot of the political and social elite in this country, and around the world, really, the royal family and all these connections. But she also was involved in the abuse herself. Many of the victims claim that Ghislaine was a participant in their abuse. So I just want to make clear that we, make sure we have the facts straight here. That she engaged in sexual assault, she engaged in grooming. She was not just a social boon for Epstein. She was actively part of this abuse. Okay. British heiress Ghislaine Maxwell will stand trial Monday on charges she procured girls for Jeffrey Epstein's underage sex ring more than a year after her arrest at a luxury hideout in New Hampshire, and 2 years after the financier killed himself in a Manhattan jail. That's obviously debatable, you guys. For them to just report killed himself as though that's fact is a little bit iffy. The 59-year-old socialite is the only member of Epstein's inner circle thus far to face a criminal indictment in the wake of his death, despite allegations from victims who say she wasn't alone in facilitating his rampant sexual abuse. She faces 8 total counts, including sex trafficking of children and sex trafficking conspiracy. 2 perjury charges will be tried separately. If convicted, she could get a maximum sentence of 80 years behind bars. Prosecutors say Maxwell groomed at least 14 girls for Epstein in the 1990s and early 2000s. These cases, to be specific, come from 94 and 2004, but we all know that there were hundreds of these cases. These are just the 2 that she's being tried for. Encouraging victims to provide paid sexualized massages to the wealthy predator in New York, New Mexico, Florida, and England. She also allegedly pushed victims to recruit other girls for the sex trafficking scheme. Maxwell has adamantly denied any wrongdoing. Her lawyers contend that the feds never charged her until their high-profile defendant was dead, and grappling with intensifying public scrutiny made her into a substitute for Epstein. Now, this is no defense of Maxwell, but there is obviously some truth to that, right? That that she should not be the only one on trial right now, you guys. Epstein should be facing trial if he wasn't likely murdered or potentially committed suicide. And it's also pretty clear that there were a lot of others involved here. So the complaint that some of these victims have is that Maxwell should not be the only one facing trial for this, that there should be others held to account for their engagement and their involvement in this as well. Maxwell's trial will feature 4 accusers who say she helped groom them to be abused by Epstein when they were still teenagers. The prosecution is planning to call at least 1 employee of Epstein's to the witness box, but sources have confirmed that several high-profile victims won't give testimony. Maxwell's defense is expected to hinge on undermining the credibility of her accusers, arguing that they had a motive to lie, in particular to obtain millions from the victims' compensation fund. Court filings also signal her lawyers will attempt to poke holes in victims' recollection of events. They've enlisted Elizabeth Loftus, a renowned false memory expert who's testified for the likes of murderous real estate heir Robert Durst and convicted rapist Harvey Weinstein as a defense witness. In the meantime, the Daily Beast has compiled a list of critical people in Epstein and Maxwell's orbit who could appear at trial, as well as those who are unlikely to show their faces on the stand. And this is the part that really kind of interests me about this more than anything, you guys. I mean, it's obviously on the surface in a vacuum, one of the most heinous and disgusting crimes imaginable. Okay. So it's relevant in and of itself with that alone. But his connections to the rich and powerful drag up some other dynamics that I think are very worth discussing. Namely the financial dynamics, that he could essentially be involved in like insider trading kind of schemes when he knows the kind of people that he knows. I mean, people in Congress, presidents, the royal family. Okay. He's connected to Bill Gates and the Dershowitz, and like, I mean, you go on and on and on, right? And that part really is interesting to me because I think it speaks to how our society can essentially allow people of this stature to get away with whatever the fuck they want. I think it inundated him from any sort of legal consequence for decades. I think it sheltered him from media criticism for decades. And then that goes both ways, right? So now you don't see the media talking about how Epstein is connected to Clinton and Trump and Dershowitz and all of these high profile characters, right? You really don't see a whole lot about how he's connected to the royal family. By the way, guys, in any other context, the royal family like does the most innocuous thing and we all have to hear about it for weeks, right? For some fucking reason. And yet this just gets cast aside and ignored. It's really quite revealing in terms of how narratives operate in our society, how we prop up the powerful, how the media operates to protect these people instead of actually do their job and hold them to some sort of account, criticize them, you know. So that's the capacity in which I'm very interested in this trial. And it's also a possibility that as part of her defense, she may reveal some things that very powerful people do not want out there. And like she's going to have the grounds. All that has to happen is the judge has to agree that it's within the bounds of her narrative for her defense. So she has a pretty vague opening to kind of insert some facts about some very powerful and wealthy people during this trial and put them on the record, right? Which is obviously, if you believe Epstein was murdered, as I think is overwhelmingly likely, it's pretty clear that he was murdered by someone who doesn't want something getting out there. Right. Once he was in custody, it was like, OK, are you going to talk? Who are you going to tell us about? So if any of that information could come out through Ghislaine's trial and be put on the record through Ghislaine's trial, that would be very interesting. And the public ought to know about that. OK, when we're talking about, I just can't drive it home enough. Presidents, members of Congress, senators, high profile celebrities, royal family. These people deserve to be scrutinized, especially if they're conducting themselves in ways that Epstein and Maxwell were conducting themselves. So my takeaway here is that I hope some information comes out of this about powerful people who have otherwise skirted any responsibility for their actions. And I also am curious to see, you know, if anything about Epstein's death might come out. I don't see how that could necessarily happen, but I hope at some point we can figure out more details surrounding his death, which is obviously incredibly suspicious. And I also feel for the victims here who are rightly saying, listen, she shouldn't be the only one on trial right now. There are a lot of other people involved. And I'm sure that they mean these powerful people, at least in part. Who knows how many people were part of this operation, but each and every one of them deserves to face some accountability for it. Because this is, as I said earlier, one of the most heinous crimes imaginable. Sexual assault of children. I mean, it really doesn't get much more disgusting than that, does it? So I feel for the victims here, having to watch as a lack of accountability it continues to exist for those who abused them. And I hope that more people will face some sort of punishment for this. And I hope that that also includes revelations about the powerful and the wealthy who have thus far gotten away with such a heinous crime. So we'll keep an eye on that trial. And the last thing I wanted to mention, you guys, it's just shameful how the media has so ignored this. We got wall-to-wall coverage for weeks about the Rittenhouse trial. And don't get me wrong, very newsworthy story and horrific, although predictable verdict. Very newsworthy story. But that, just think about it in terms of narratives. That is much more convenient for both cultures. The culture war sort of feeds off the narratives coming out of the Rittenhouse trial, right? The left and the right both found that a convenient topic to discuss. And again, I'm not trying to undermine the importance or newsworthiness of the Rittenhouse trial. I'm just pointing out that the media exclusively covered that while there were other very important things going on, including this trial. So it's awfully convenient to ignore the trial that has implications for the powerful while you endlessly hand-wring about a trial that you can kind of exploit on culture war grounds, right? A conflict line that you can exploit for viewership. And I just want to make sure everybody understands the dynamics that go into what the media chooses to cover, what it chooses not to cover, and how important that is. That they do not want to talk about this should be very revealing. So we will continue to keep up on the Ghislaine Maxwell trial and the Epstein story in general, and how these elites, these powerful groups are able to just get away with whatever the fuck they want. And very rarely face any form of transparency or accountability for it. So another press story here about how this is a little more explicit version of a lie, but very interesting. Alec Karakatsanis, if you don't follow him, I strongly encourage you to. He's constantly tweeting about the Justice Department and law enforcement and putting facts out there that the mainstream media is not going to enlighten the public with, right? So this is a thread I want to read for you guys. Thread. Yesterday, the New York Times published a headline it knew was false. The implications of this are dangerous for everyone who cares about an informed public. Here's what happened. New York Times wrote another pro-police propaganda piece that had all of the usual problems I've discussed before, more on that below, but the editors chose to add a headline that stated that, quote, murders doubled overnight in the Bronx, New York. Here's where it gets devious, and you guys can see the title there. After murders doubled overnight, the NYPD is solving fewer cases. In the Bronx, where the percentage of murders solved by the police has plunged, one family is waiting impatiently for a day that may not come. Now, he's going to go into this, but I want you to note that they put the single quotes around doubled overnight. That's important. And here he explains that. Notice that the NYT editors chose to put the doubled overnight in quotes. Why? It's a signal they aren't reporting it as a verified fact, but as a quote from a source. In the article body, we learn they are quoting a former cop turned local professor. Here it gets more devious. In the article body, it's not murders that the former cop expert is saying doubled overnight. He is actually claiming that police caseloads doubled overnight. In other words, the force itself is in charge of this, you guys. It's just an allocation of resources issue. Let me note here that this expert is wrong. It isn't true that caseloads literally doubled overnight. New York Times didn't quote an opposing expert, show stats, tell readers that the person they quoted was wrong, it's verifiable with some reporting, or disclose he was a former cop. So they just ran with this quote that they knew was not only misleading, but factually incorrect. And they ran with it as a headline, which is even worse, because a lot of people read a headline and don't read the body, right? So they knew full well what they were doing here and how this was going to impact public opinion. The New York Times even let this former police officer expert add, that's the unfortunate truth. It's not the truth. Here it gets worse. See the sleight of hand? New York Times editors took the false caseloads quote, put it in quotes, and then put it in the headline as applying to murders. They did this because a larger number of people will see the headline. They did it to create clicks and outrage. It's all false. Murders didn't double overnight, not even close, as others have noted. The New York Times editors knew that, hence putting it in quotation so they could deny making the assertion themselves. And he shares a quote here from Chloe Cockburn. It's truly mind-boggling how supposedly respectable news outlets print totally false things we can easily check by looking at public data about crime. And people swallow it because they never expect the New York Times to completely misrepresent something as basic as this. She goes on to share another tweet that verifies what they're saying. Note that the insertion of the quotes, the easily available homicide data that New York Times has itself reported on before, and the many people pointing out the lie make it clear that editors chose to print this falsity intentionally, and it's still up online on Twitter a day later. We have an update on that coming later in the thread. But as an aside, the expert point about caseloads was also silly. It's an NYPD choice to devote smaller numbers of cops to serious crimes, and most cops are arresting very poor people for drugs and minor stuff. 96% of all police time nationwide is on what cops call non-violent. That's according to police departments themselves, you guys. So when they hand-wring about, you can't cut our budgets, what about all the violent crime? They're currently only putting 4% of their resources to violent crime. So don't let them get away with that. That's not what they do. So we could cut 96% of their budget without touching violent crime. Okay. The rest of the article is outrageous. Here are the expert sources it quotes supposedly to help explain what's happening. 1, a police lieutenant. 2, the police say generically. Don't you love that one? It's like when a CNN anchor says, well, people say, and what they really mean is all these Washington establishment goons are telling me, right? But they frame it like, well, people are saying. A former cop, undisclosed, another former cop, undisclosed, another police lieutenant, and that's it. So what did? They regurgitated what cops say. They played stenographer for police departments. The article is copaganda. I love that term. Without contrary views, experts, civil liberties advocates, crime survivors who disagree, etc. Article lets cops call for more surveillance in more surveyed communities. The police say some of the city's most dangerous pockets do not have enough. The police say. Gee, I wonder why the police might want more fucking money. But what do the mostly poor, mostly people of color who've been organizing across New York City against New York PD's expanded and profitable corporate military contractor surveillance programs think? We aren't told because the New York Times chooses to leave out their voice. That's an editorial choice. It gets worse. New York Times then lets anonymous police spew a discredited police union talking point that these issues are caused by new laws requiring shares of basic info with defense lawyers to bring New York State in line with the rest of the country, example, Texas and the Constitution. So now they want to claim that defense attorneys shouldn't be given information that they have a constitutional right to. That claim is garbage. Ali Watkins, who's the New York Times writer who wrote this piece of trash. It's astonishing that New York Times lets anonymous police sources blame this on basic discovery laws that exist across the country and are a basic component of truth in trials. There is no evidence to support it and no contrary point of view printed. Even worse, New York Times then lets a lieutenant blame poor communities of color for not cooperating with cops. Laughably, lieutenant blames a lack of desire to work with cops on due process discovery laws, not on decades of corruption, brutality, and ineffectiveness in making people safe. You cannot make this shit up, you guys. You really cannot make this shit up. New York Times editors chose not to print a contrary point of view to explain why poor communities might not like cooperating with the largest and most racially discriminatory human caging bureaucracy in modern world history that many believe has not kept them safe but made them less safe. It's part of at least 3 broader patterns. First, the New York Times has a long and disturbing recent history of propaganda, and he shares some examples there. Second, corporate news in general often disproportionately covers and creates a sense of urgency about certain kinds of crime, but does not create the same urgency around objectively larger threats to public health and safety. And again, he's posting threads here as evidence. If you guys want to go check it out, I encourage you to. Third, when it does cover a narrow range of crime, New York Times often links problems to police talking points. Need for more cops, weapons, surveillance, and human caging. This link is profitable to corporations, but it's like climate denial given the available science. And we went over just a few weeks ago a thread by Alec breaking down some of the stats that disprove this notion that caging people somehow, cuts down on crime. It doesn't at all. The stats just don't bear that out at all. There are many wonderful journalists working to shed light on the great issues of our time, like the things that threaten our survival as a species and that makes society less safe and just. But this threatens that work by boosting police repression and reducing trust in the media. Update. Here is a profanity-laden tirade by the ex-cop professor quoted in the New York Times piece confirming that the headline is false. The headline is still up, even though yesterday the person quoted said publicly he was misquoted. And they give credit here to the journalist. I went and looked at that thread, you guys. The guy that they quoted, the ex-cop, the professor that they quoted, said that he never said what the New York Times put in quotes. I mean, it gets even worse and even more disingenuous as we dig deeper. The New York Times has now changed the headline to remove the false claim. Will be interesting to see if paper issues a correction explaining who made the decision to print the knowingly false claim, how the decision was made, and why. Another update, the former police officer turned professor who New York Times chose to quote has now blocked me for some reason. I don't think I've ever spoken to him online or otherwise. Here's a screenshot of the relevant portion of his tirade where he agrees that the headline is false. Update, others have pointed out that I missed another blatant pro-police lie in the New York Times article that New York police had been solving 90% of murders. Again, public data is easily accessible. They are not. You see these numbers down here, 27, 26, 32, and 26. Not 90% of murders. New York Times reporter repeated false claims on Twitter. So far, the paper has issued no explanation of how this could happen and what kinds of accountability there will be. This stuff matters, especially to those who will be targeted if the cops quoted get what they want. And another update, New York Times reporter Ali Watkins has not corrected the tweet about this. I've commented on this reporter's bias before, but at this point, we need to understand from the editors how this is allowed to continue. Here is a piece I hope they grapple with. Just fantastic work here from Alec. Really encourage you all to follow him if you don't. At Equality Alec on Twitter. Always sharing stuff like this. And shame on the New York Times. Again, it's not necessarily surprising, but this is a pretty brazen and egregious version of the propaganda, as Alec calls it, compared to what we often see. So that goes beyond disingenuity, you guys, where it's like, we're going to mislead you. We're going to misframe things. We're going to take things out of context. That is an out and out lie that they printed in a disingenuous way, knowing the impact that would have on readers. It's egregious, beyond egregious. And it also, it disproves any sort of like legitimate incentive or principled incentive. You can't just say, well, they screwed up. Because what's the goal in printing something like that, even if you think it's true? The goal is to stoke fear. Okay. So there's no principled, like, no, the public needs to know about this. No, your goal is to fearmonger and divide, right? With the obvious added incentive of police budgets and pro-police nonsense, right? So I thought that was very worth discussing. Huge shout out to Alec for the stuff he puts out there and the way that he breaks these things down for those who would not otherwise have been exposed to the way that the New York Times operates on these stories. Great work from Alec. Shame on the New York Times. They need to come out and explain what the fuck happened there. That's even worse than the stuff they normally do, really. So we have a disturbing story about COVID. I'm sure a number of you have been following the new variant, Omicron. I just want to, actually, you know what? Before I dive into this Reuters piece, I've been saying since I've been with Real Progressives, maybe even before that, I joined, I think, in April. So I've been here 6 or 7 months. You guys can go back and watch my broadcasts. You will see me saying repeatedly that we need to waive the IP rights on vaccines. We need to go forward with the TRIPS waiver for not only to be decent fucking human beings, right? Like to provide for impoverished countries a vaccine that they need to fucking survive and to not have this pandemic drag on and continue to impact their lives. Not only the very obvious we should be decent to these people argument. The other argument is variance. When you do not vaccinate large enough portions of the world, you leave the door open to variants that render those vaccines less effective or even completely ineffective. And what do we have now? We have numerous strains coming out that are able to break through the vaccine better than the original strain, which is exactly what was predicted by virologists from the get-go. I was saying last spring, and not just me, I'm not trying to take credit here. I'm not a virologist, you guys. I just happen to know where to look for this shit. Lefties have been saying since spring, you need to waive these rights in order to avoid a variant that will cripple us once again. So even if you're going to be a selfish prick about the whole thing and only care about the United States and rich countries, you should want everybody to have access to this vaccine so that we can try to avoid these kinds of variants. Okay? And now Biden, after how many months? 7 or 8 months, he's finally now going to consider like going forward with these IP rights waivers. To be fair, he came out I don't remember when it was, maybe June or something. I might have that month wrong, but he came out a while ago and supported the TRIPS waiver. It's now mostly European countries that are opposing the TRIPS waiver. But he has apparently behind the scenes not actually done anything to push things in that direction. He's just taken the public position. Well, now he apparently is starting to realize that might actually fucking matter. We might actually need to vaccinate impoverished countries too. What an indictment on his character and his intellect. Seriously. That it took this long to recognize the importance of this stuff. And I had to go on a little bit of a rant there because we have been saying from the jump, you need to vaccinate everybody in order to actually get us out of this fucking pandemic. Not just your country, not just wealthy countries. Doesn't work like that, you guys. Anyhow, this is in Reuters. Omicron variant spreads. Cases detected in Netherlands, Denmark, and Australia. The Omicron coronavirus variant kept spreading around the world on Sunday, with 13 cases found in the Netherlands, 2 each in Denmark and Australia, even as more countries imposed travel restrictions to try to seal themselves off. Dutch health authorities said that the 13 cases of the variant were found among people on 2 flights that arrived in Amsterdam from South Africa on Friday. Those flights had some 600 people on them combined. Authorities had tested all of the more than 600 passengers on these 2 flights and had found 61 coronavirus cases going on to test those for the new variant. Quote, it is not unlikely more cases will appear in the Netherlands. Health Minister Hugo de Jong, I'm sure I butchered that name, apologies, told the news conference in Rotterdam. This could possibly be the tip of the iceberg. The discovery of Omicron, dubbed a variant of concern last week by the World Health Organization, has caused worry around the world that it could resist vaccinations and prolong the nearly 2-year COVID-19 pandemic. We're at 2 years, by the way, you guys. It was 2 years ago that this started. The first reports in China came out late November 2019. First discovered in South Africa, it has now been detected in Britain, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Denmark, Belgium, Botswana, Israel, Australia, and Hong Kong. It's everywhere. We know this now, you guys, from previous variants of this stuff. We know that once we start seeing it in numerous places, it's everywhere. We just haven't found it yet. So you're going to start seeing cases in the United States. I guarantee it. Omicron is potentially more contagious than previous variants, although it is unclear whether it causes more or less severe COVID-19 compared to other strains. Many countries have imposed travel bans or curbs on southern Africa to try to stem the spread. Financial markets dived on Friday as investors worried that the variant could stall a global recovery. Oil prices tumbled by about $10 a barrel. A South African doctor who was one of the first to suspect a different coronavirus strain said on Sunday that symptoms of the Omicron variant were so far mild and could be treated at home. So that is good news, but I want to make sure everybody understands severity is only one part of this, and in many ways, the extent of the contagiousness of the variant is more important. How fast it can spread is more important. You have more success with viruses that have high hospitalization and death rates, but low contagion than you do the opposite. So that this is a very contagious strain is deeply concerning, and indicative that we may not be nearly close to out of this pandemic. Again, 2 years in, we may very well not be out of this yet. And I wanted to point out, I think it was David Sirota that shared this tweet, but South Africa has been begging for vaccines, you guys, literally begging for the TRIPS waiver to go forward. And all these wealthy nations say, no, fuck you. And now what do we get? We prioritize the profits of Pfizer and Moderna and Johnson & Johnson over the well-being of human beings everywhere, including our own constituents, as this variant now comes back to bite us all in the ass. So honestly, how did we get rid of smallpox, you guys? How did we get people to do it? How did we not fold to big pharma, right? How did we not have massive waves of conspiratorial anti-vaxxers derailing our attempts to eradicate smallpox? How did we do it? It appears that this may be a perpetual pandemic, at least in the near future. And that is an awfully big shame. That is just really fucking sad, you guys. Not just in so many ways it's sad, right? We've seen mental health issues spike. We've seen addiction spike. People are not living the quality of life that they want to be living. And And 2 years is a long goddamn time. You're lucky if you got 100 years on this earth. You're really fucking lucky if you got 100 years on this earth. That's 2% of your life gone. And we're just going to continue to refuse to address this in any robust capacity. It's just a damn shame. And shame on Biden, shame on Big Pharma, shame on Europe, shame on anybody participating in this prioritization of profits for big pharmaceutical companies over the well-being of human beings all around the world. We will also keep up on that story. Obviously, I think that this has the potential to be incredibly problematic. Just outrageous stuff, really outrageous stuff. I want to show you guys a clip. I'm sure some of you followed the Ahmaud Arbery, the trial for those accused of murdering who now have been convicted. Ahmaud Arbery. I hate myself for saying it that way because I was so it was the Kyle Rittenhouse trial, right? Because he's the one being tried, and yet for some reason it was referred to as the Ahmaud Arbery trial, which I that just tells you quite a bit about our media and our legal system right there, right? Anyhow, this is a short clip of one of the defense attorneys making one of the most disgusting, nauseating, racially charged comments that I have ever seen in a courtroom. So we'll watch this. It's a short clip. We'll come back and discuss.
Turning Ahmaud Arbery into a victim after the choices that he made does not reflect the reality of what brought Ahmaud Arbery to Satilla Shores in his khaki shorts with no socks to cover his long, dirty toenails.
Wow. I mean, I don't even know where to start with that one, you guys. Somehow his toenails are relevant to this case. And also, she tries to frame him like he's some sort of nefarious dude. He was going for a run. So he deserves to be murdered for going for a run without socks? Really? And you have to engage in that kind of brazen, disgusting racism. I mean, I think it's almost more telling that she felt so comfortable getting up on the stand and saying that than anything else. I'm not stunned that she herself is okay with that, right? That her character is so condemnable that she's okay with saying that. What's to me very stunning is that knowing full well that this is a case that's getting media coverage, she's going to go up and say, I really don't have much to add except this is the extent of the racism in our institutions, and this is the extent of what we allow as a society, you guys. And that's again a damn shame. That is condemnable. That is nauseating. That should make everybody sick to their stomach. Thankfully, these men were obviously found guilty, as they obviously should have been. They hunted down a man who was on a run and killed him. I don't know if you guys saw, I wish I queued this up now, but Tulsi Gabbard put out a rather horrendous tweet about this. She said that their being found guilty proves that America is not a racist country. Almost like completely ignoring the entire story. A man was killed over race. And she's like, yeah, it proves that we're not a racist country. Tulsi has either completely fallen off her rocker or she did a decent job of fooling us years ago. Because she's now, in my view, one of the worst actors in American politics. To say that is beyond disgusting. And it's also, I wonder if she would say the same thing about the result from Breonna Taylor's murder or Philando Castillo or any of the other, innumerable names, too many names to remember. Would she say the same thing about them? Would she say the same thing about Floyd? Does it prove that we're not a racist country because Chauvin was convicted? I'd say it proves we are a racist country that 3 cops stood there and watched Chauvin murder him. you talk about missing the forest for the trees. Tulsi seems to be an expert at that at this point. And I honestly, there's a part of me that thinks she doesn't even believe what she tweeted. There's a part of me that thinks she is just a completely cynical actor who's after clicks and views and popularity, and knew full well that that tweet would draw attention, good and bad. That she could appeal to white supremacists and also draw attention from lefties criticizing her. There's a part of me that's just thinking she's to the point of being that cynical. And that self-interested. But anyhow, I felt the need to show you guys that clip. This is when we talk about critical race theory, when we talk about critical legal theory, that is the kind of thing you get. And again, for someone like Tulsi to come forward and say, well, these convictions prove we're not a racist country. You are out of your ever-loving mind. You're willfully ignoring reality if that's your take. The man was killed for being black, and you're going to say this proves we're not racist? I mean, you just can't, beyond ridiculous. And speaking of, I guess, sort of police, in this particular case, we have a story out of San Francisco, how cops basically let a pot shop get burglarized. Sat by and watched it happen, right? So they hand-wring about, you need us to stop crime, and then the second that it's a pot shop, this is rather hilarious. This is in the Daily Beast. San Francisco police sit and watch as burglars escape. San Francisco police sat and watched from a squad car as burglars dawdled while bagging up wares from a cannabis dispensary, slowly left the store and drove away, according to surveillance footage obtained by the San Francisco Chronicle. The suspects, unidentified and still at large, had time to make a 3-point turn in front of a police car before driving away. The cops arrived while the crime was in progress and shone their lights on the suspect's car, but did not pursue the suspects. The business owner, Tariq Mizyed Al-Azray, apologies if I butchered that name, said of the November 16th burglary, quote, if you watched what took place, you would think the police were in on it. Al-Azray said the thieves stole thousands of dollars from merchandise in large bags. San Francisco's Department of Police Accountability has opened an investigation into the incident, according to the Chronicle. Really, really funny story there. It just kind of shows you, like, cops like to hide behind this, like, I don't choose the laws, I just enforce it. No, you don't. You choose when to enforce it. That's the same fucking thing. So it's perhaps unsurprising that they would choose to allow a pot shop to be burglarized, because obviously cops hate marijuana laws because it cuts into their need for fun, their need for existence, right? They have to be able to claim crime in order to justify their own existence and to oppose pushes to cut their budget or defund or abolish them. And so they rely on this, like, oh, the humanity, look at all the crime. So the more things that are left as illegal, things like smoking pot that all of society thinks should not be illegal, they have this desire to continue punishing people for anything possible, right? Because it justifies their existence. It justifies their ridiculous funding. By the way, just a quick aside, you guys, did you know that the United States, there's only one military other than the United States military in the world, that's China, that spends more than United States police do? Our police funding in this country would rank third in the world in military funding, and one of the groups it's behind is our own military. This is imperialism. This is funding authority and violence instead of uplifting communities to eradicate the crime and violence from inception. So, you know, this is a continuation of police attempting to justify their own existence and therefore refusing to enforce the law when it happens to be a crime committed against a group that they dislike. So this is what police do. So the next time that you, again, it's this concept of formalism, you guys, that we need to just totally rid ourselves of. It doesn't apply to reality. Cops don't enforce the same law equally regardless of who they're dealing with. Courts don't provide the same result to two different people that did the exact same thing. They don't. That formalism doesn't exist. You get differences in outcome based on social discrepancies, economic discrepancies, racial discrepancies, etc. So the cops in their own way are participating in the culture war here, and they've clearly taken a side, right? Let this guy get robbed because he owns a pot shop, right? Fuck our constituents that overwhelmingly said this is a legitimate business. Fuck the law that we claim to, that we always hide behind, right? Don't blame us. It's just the law that we're enforcing. No, you're not. Not when you don't want to, you don't. Anyhow, this is the type of thing that we're talking about when we talk about systemic police misconduct. And this is another, I actually think, a strong example of why we need to just start from scratch on the whole issue. You can't save this department, you guys. You think you can reform that? Seriously? You can't. So this is to me a compelling argument. They choose not to do their job when they don't want to. And then they choose to be violent with people when it's unnecessary. They're wrong on every single side of this, every single one. And as Alec covered earlier in his tweet thread, only 4% of police resources go to violent crime. So when they try to hide behind that, no, you can't cut our funding. What about all the murders? Well, why don't you spend more of your funding, current funding, on violent crime then? Why don't you put more resources into solving violent crime as opposed to writing traffic tickets and beating people up for smoking pot? Most of what cops do have nothing to do with violent crime. And anyhow, I got off on a little bit of a tangent there about police, but that story is absolutely hilarious and I think indicative of some of the big problems. Police as an institution. So another story here. This was shared by Stephanie Kelton on Twitter. Maybe last week. I might be a little bit behind on this story, but I thought it was worth discussing because we've been hearing for a long time about how we have a trucker shortage in the United States. Not enough drivers, right? Well, this is in time. The truck driver shortage doesn't exist. Saying there is one makes conditions worse for drivers. As the U.S. contends with supply chain problems that could make holiday shopping harder, one explanation comes up again and again. The country doesn't have enough truckers. The biggest kink in America's supply chain, not enough truckers. A New York Times story read this week. Again, the New York Times knowingly lying and misleading their viewership. Where are all the truck drivers? Shortage adds to delivery delays, cried a Wall Street Journal headline the week before. In reality, there is no shortage of people who want to get into truck driving, nor is there a shortage of people who have obtained commercial driving licenses. The stories inevitably cite a report from the American Trucking Association that says the industry is short 80,000 drivers and quote experts who blame the alleged shortage on a lack of people interested in these difficult jobs. Yet in California alone, there are 640,445 people who hold active Class A and Class B commercial driver's license, according to the Department of Motor Vehicles. Meanwhile, there are only 140,000 truck transportation jobs in the state, according to the State Employment Development Department. So they're trying to say that in the nation, we're short 80,000 drivers. California covers that by 420,000 drivers. California alone covers that by 420,000 drivers. A ridiculous lie that has somehow been perpetrated by the mainstream media quite successfully. Those numbers speak to the fact that there are hundreds of thousands of people who become truck drivers every year, some with their training subsidized by the government, only to find that the job pays much less than they'd been led to believe and that working conditions in the industry are terrible. A problem of too many truckers. There's no trucker shortage. There's a trucker retention problem created by the poor conditions that sprung up in the industry in the wake of 1980s deregulation. Turnover for truck drivers in fleets with more than $30 million of annual revenue was 92% at the end of 2020, meaning roughly 9 out of every 10 drivers will no longer be working for that company in a year. Quote, "There's no shortage of workers. That's the narrative that gets propagated by industry leaders," says Mike Chavez, the executive director of the Inland Empire Labor Institute, which is working on a partnership to create better recruiting and retention programs for drivers. We still have a lot of positions that can't be filled because of the working conditions. There were 1.5 million people employed in trucking last month, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, just 1% fewer than in October 2019 and 15% more than a decade ago. That's a faster growth rate than overall non-farm employment, which is still down 2% from October 2019 and up only 12% from a decade ago. And guys, this particular story has, it carries a lot of weight in the sense that there are like 20 some states, maybe even 30 some states. I think it's 20 some states in the country where trucking is the number one private job. So a lot of people are truck drivers, you guys. They said 1.5 million people employed in trucking last month, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So this is a major job, right? It's not as though this is a job that very few people work. It's a critical job, and it's critical for all other, and not all, almost all other industries too. Because if you're making a product, if you're making a good, it has to be delivered somehow. It has to get to the distribution plant. It has to get to that storefront, or it has to be delivered to your customer's door. That's truck drivers, right? So it's amazing to me how the media always tries to flip this somehow into a narrative that is about the workers being the problem, right? No, they're just too lazy. They just don't want the hard work. No, actually, there are hundreds of thousands of people licensed to drive who are like, fuck your working conditions. So we've seen, and I think this is a positive. We're going to talk a lot about labor stuff here momentarily. And I've overall been quite motivated by sort of ecstatic about this, actually, hopeful about this, in the sense that these narratives seem to be changing somewhat. You see across the political spectrum, people respond to the quote labor shortage by saying, no, there's actually a pay shortage. Treat your workers right and pay them decently, and you will not have a shortage of workers. So I've been sort of I'm not finding the word I want, but it makes me hopeful. It's a heartwarming story. It's you know, I'm glad to see that narrative is starting to change at least a little bit. And that seems to also be the case with this trucking situation. They try to blame the workers themselves, and it turns out it's actually that you're grossly mistreating and undercompensating said workers. So anyhow, inspirational stories in the labor movements right now. And on that note, we will get to some clips I have. More Perfect Union, as always, providing fantastic clips about strikes and walkouts and protests and all this kind of stuff, unionization efforts, etc. First one we're going to show here is about Amazon, and I also have a clip from an interview with Chris Smalls, who's one of the lead organizers to unionize Amazon, that we'll watch momentarily here. But this is More Perfect Union discussing Amazon's unionization efforts.
Opportunity to talk to Jeff Bezos face to face. I would really want to ask him, have he ever worked in a warehouse before? Have he sweated for 10 to 12 hours a day and not being able to go to the restroom when he needed to go?
And the issue of working conditions, I'm very proud of our working conditions.
They got cameras, they watching us all the time.
It's a lot of walking, it's a lot of fast pace, it's a lot of climbing upstairs. It's just a lot for the human body.
It's tiring, it's consistent, it's fast speed, it's unsafe because you consistently working fast pace 10 hours, only 2 breaks.
They're getting treated like robots, and it's not fair because even robots break down sometimes. I have issues when ladies are talking about TOT time, time off task, when they have to go use the restroom. When they saying that the restroom could be on the other side of the building, that they have to take their walk so far and they're timing them. And when they run out of time, people are calling me emotional, like, Michael, I'm on last chance. They said it's extremely hot in there. They said they have had people to pass out because of the extreme hotness in there.
Who get doctored or get TOT time for going to the bathroom? Who get doctored for going to get water if you need water, if you have to leave off your station? Come on now.
I work on the line. I work in decant, and I actually open packages and store them in the bin, but it's a lot of standing all day. And my day-to-day there is working so many hours without having the breaks that we need. It's really strenuous on the body. I've been to the doctor several times with issues with my own body, with my legs.
It's unsafe because you consistently working fast-paced 10 hours, only 2 breaks.
Amazon will change their schedule in the middle of the night while they're sleeping. They don't even know their schedule's been changed. They wake up thinking that they got an off day and they supposed to be at work at 7 o'clock in the morning.
We've been having confirmed cases every week. It's unsafe to me because we don't know who have it. We don't know who we've been around, who have it.
I have people with issues about COVID-19. They haven't received their COVID pay. They've been off for weeks. Some people are back to work and still haven't received COVID pay. Man, this is heartbreaking. A lot of people need their money. They don't have a way to pay their bills, and they're looking for a pay that's supposed to come to them but haven't received it yet. They're owned by the richest man in the world, so we know the issue cannot be that he doesn't have the money.
I feel like every employee, as well as myself, deserve more due to what we do. And I feel like it's not fair.
Amazon says that they're there for their employees. To us, they hear our voices, but they're not responding to our voices.
And we have very good communications with our employees. So we don't believe that we need a union to be an intermediary between us and our employees.
So now with us bringing in the union, we feel better that we have somebody that will sit down and talk to him about the working conditions that we're having and the dignity and respect that we're looking for.
We need the union out of Amazon to make things better, fair. We need job security, better wages.
But a union represents you when you don't have the voice to represent yourself.
So probably unsurprising to most of my audience that Amazon behaves this way and that these workers have to fight tooth and nail the way that they do, but always worth sharing whenever I see this content. More Perfect Union, again, we're going to have a couple more from them here in a little bit. I just want to encourage everybody to follow their work if you haven't been thus far. They absolutely fantastic work, all sorts of industries all across the country. They cover labor issues. And on the Amazon topic, for those who don't know Chris Smalls, he was fired by Amazon for organizing. Now, of course, that can't be proven in court. If it could, he would have a serious case against them. But they very obviously fired him for organizing and trying to unionize, which is brazenly illegal. And he went on Breaking Points to discuss the current efforts in New York, and they talked a little bit about Bessemer too, and how the NLRB has found Amazon to have violated the law in trying to squash these unions. So this is Chris Smalls on Breaking Points, and then we'll come back and discuss.
Now for an update on efforts to unionize Amazon's workforce is Chris Smalls. He is an activist and an organizer. Great to see you, Chris.
Likewise. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Always a pleasure. So just give us an update on your strategy and what's going on in Staten Island.
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, we're still in the beginning phases of our fight. I know it kind of was a bummer that we had to withdraw. But we had to withdraw because basically our time expired from the time we filed.
Just walk people through that a little bit, because there's some people aren't familiar with the process of you have to collect a certain number of signatures and you have to file those signatures. So just take people from the beginning through the process.
Absolutely. Yeah, so we filed on October 25th. We had the requirement, the 30% to file. We filed that number. I don't want to give specific numbers because obviously that gives the company an advantage. But we filed what we thought was the bargaining unit, and we met our requirements for that 30%. The NLRB then contacted me saying that Amazon wanted to push the hearing back 2 weeks. So of course I said, no, we're ready to go. We were originally scheduled to go to court on November 15th. The NLRB then sent me another letter saying that Amazon has filed another motion to push it back. Please reconsider. I said no again, but the NLRB is allowed to give them a 2-day extension, which they did. So they changed the date from November 15th to November 17th. Then the NLRB said, hey, you need a couple more 100 signatures. So I said, okay, no problem. We're allowed 2 days extended to get that amount. So we met that requirement, brought them a couple hundred more signatures within the 48 hour. But within the 48 hour, Amazon also filed another motion for the NLRB to actually to do a card check because they didn't believe that our cards were legitimate. So during that card check, the NLRB determined that we needed more cards. So which I went back to the NLRB office a second time and dropped off more cards. Mm-hmm. So we met the requirements multiple times, but still, when it came to determination, they determined that we needed to get more cards because a lot of the folks that signed up during the 7-month campaign no longer work for the company.
Got it. See, so this is very important, Chris. We were doing this because we want people to understand the exact mechanics of how this stuff actually works and some of the things that you're up against whenever you're trying to unionize. We've got some reporting here from Status Quo. Let's put this up there on the screen about leaked audio of Amazon's union-busting meeting showing HR officials pushing workers against unionizing. Can you just describe to us a little bit about what was revealed there?
Yeah, absolutely. They're doing the captive audiences, obviously, since we filed. They were preparing for an election because they knew that we had the requirements, but unfortunately it didn't go in our favor to get to that point. But they still have held these meetings, and a lot of the members of ALU have been recording these meetings and disrupting them. Not only just recording them, but they've been disrupting them. Yes, they're bringing 50 to 60 people into these classrooms at a time. And they're pretty much spreading a bunch of lies. They're allowed to do that legally, which I don't agree with. But they're just spreading lies, creating doubt, saying that we're going to take money, saying that we're inexperienced. They're trying to say that, we're some third party. We're not actual Amazon workers. That's the way they try to throw their information out there. And basically that Amazon is going to take care of all their associates' needs, which we all know that is a lie. You know that Amazon does not really care about folks. They just replace them. So that's what we're up against right now. We're in that phase where we have the onslaught of these captive audiences. But I can say in our favor, because we've been disrupting them so well, they actually suspended them. So that's where we at right now currently. Mm.
So that interview went on, but I wanted to show you guys the start to get the gist of where they're at with their organizing process and all that. If you haven't followed Chris Smalls, really recommend that you look into him. His story is quite incredible. He was obviously fired by Amazon for organizing, which is brazenly illegal, and he has continued those efforts and pushed to try to unionize in various areas, and that effort is ongoing. The NLRB, you guys. I think it's pretty clear that they all often lean on the side of big business, and that's not what their role is supposed to be at all. They're supposed to be like an arbiter for these union elections, right? But it's pretty clear every time that Amazon, you heard him talk there, every time Amazon wants an extra couple days, they get it, right? Every time Amazon wants to put the organizers in a pinch, they get to do it. And the NLRB constantly coming down on the side of Amazon. And I think some of that it could be solved with just simple policy, and the PRO Act would actually arm the NLRB to enforce things in a way that they currently don't have the teeth to enforce. So they're and obviously the PRO Act opposed not just by Republicans but by corporate Democrats as well. So there's a lot of things that could be done about this, but even the reason I'm going down this path is even the NLRB, which appears to be quite pro big business in many instances. Even they found Amazon to have violated the law in Bessemer, and as Chris noted there, suspending them. So this is, an indication of just how far these companies will go to try to squash unionization efforts. And I very much support Amazon workers across the country and Chris in their efforts to oppose that. And I also just want to make really clear, if it's not already really clear, don't let Amazon portray themselves as some sort of like progressive, forward-thinking, good for their workers company, because that's what they try to do. I know I say this almost every time they come up, but it's very important. They drive wages down. They try to act as though because they start at $15 an hour, they're somehow progressive and forward-thinking. It's not the case, you guys. Warehouse workers around the country make low to mid 20s per hour on average, depending on the region, of course. Well, Amazon comes into regions where people are making 24, 25 an hour, and they start at 15. They're dragging wages down, yet they somehow get to portray themselves, and this is a fault of the media, but they're allowed to portray themselves as a progressive company. It's insane. It's absurd. They work their workers into perpetual injuries and health problems, chronic health problems, back, joint problems. You'd be stunned by the number of suicide attempts that happen at Amazon warehouses and how often 911 is called because there was a suicide attempt at an Amazon. You'd be stunned. They are awful to their workers. We know all about, I'm sure many of you remember maybe half a year ago or something, there was that hilarious bit about Amazon trying to deny that their drivers have to piss and shit in bottles in order to meet delivery times and don't get any breaks that they're legally entitled to, and all this kind of stuff, right? Underpaid, all that stuff. Kind of lines up with the trucker story we covered earlier, right? You don't want to drive for Amazon, trust me. So anyhow, I support all of these efforts. I think it's great that we're going after some of these huge companies too. It's not, they're the hardest ones to get because Amazon has the resources to bring in all the top union busting law firms. They have the influence with the press to, Bezos owns the Washington Post, and they have all these ins with DC and big politicians and big media in New York and all this. So they have the leverage in every possible sense to shut this down. And we're still like, no, not fucking scared of you. We're going to unionize. I love it, you guys. It's inspirational. It's one of the few stories that I get to cover that I end up feeling good about. You know what I mean? Most stories in politics, unfortunately, are quite depressing. This one is uplifting and inspirational. And I wish these organizers all the best and hope that we have some good news to bring you on this front in the near future. I have another more perfect union clip. In fact, I have a couple more perfect union clips for you this week, in part because I missed the show last week. This is about Tesla workers, and obviously Elon Musk similarly tries to portray himself as though he's like not as, rapacious and draconian in how he treats his workers as most corporations are. Of course, that's not remotely true. He engages in sweatshop labor in Southeast Asia. He took billions in public subsidies to start his company in the first place. He's not somehow like a progressive business owner, right? So this is a more perfect union once again talking with Tesla workers.
Got their leg ran over on the line. People got sent out for exhaustion. People throwing up at random because of not drinking enough water. Management never really cared. All they care about is hitting numbers, doing whatever they can to please Elon.
Do you think that this is sustainable? This pace is sustainable?
Yeah, so we'll probably have, a 3 or 4-fold increase in Model 3 output in the second quarter.
I got hurt in seat manufacturing.
Pure agonizing pain. I jumped up and my arm was just hanging.
In orientation, they're like, oh, you're gonna really love it here. This is a good place to work. I had no clue what I was getting myself into.
Dennis Duran worked in the paint department at Tesla's Fremont, California factory for 5 years.
The paint shop's really operating at full tilt, so adding any complexity to the paint shop would not be wise right now, but
Once I got there, they were like, okay, so Dennis, you know we were going to work a lot of hours, so we just want to let you know we don't really know when we're going to have our next days off, so we might just work maybe 8-10 days straight and then maybe get 2 days off. I was like, oh, this is new. I started first in wet sand. Basically, you had to sand the car for 12 hours with a sander that's bigger than my hand. So after just 4 days of 12 hours, my fourth day, it was really bad. I woke up with like a cramp all in my arm, and oh, it hurt so badly. I guess that's why like the wet sand sanders would say 8 hours is the max total.
In 2015 alone, the rate of serious injury at Tesla's Fremont factory was 102% above the industry average. And in 2016, it was above the average by 82.5%. Tesla claims its 2019 injury rate dropped below the industry average, but the Center for Investigative Reporting found that Tesla underreported its injuries that year. On top of that, California's inspection agency said it couldn't verify Tesla's claims about safety improvements.
Basically, everybody would cut their arms and hands. Sometimes people would bleed off the line and have to run to the bathroom, so it would be a man down, a second person. I would have to stop the line, and once you stop it, if you stop the line there, management come over, would start yelling at you, and they'd be like, why did he cut his hand? What is he doing? Oh, change him out with someone better. Almost like a modern day industrial sweatshop.
Dennis tried to help organize a union to gain more of a voice, but Musk and Tesla stopped it by illegally threatening, harassing, and firing workers, according to the NLRB.
Management makes you want to feel like they're the superior, you should be afraid, you should appease me. That's basically, the culture was always there, basically an extreme hierarchy.
The amount of time that workers took off for injuries tripled in 2018 as Tesla launched the Model 3.
A mass market, affordable car. We need to achieve high volume production. Our Fremont factory in the past has actually made almost 500,000 cars a year. So we're confident that Tesla can achieve that number in the future in terms of vehicle production.
Musk had planned for the Model 3 to be produced almost entirely by robots, until Tesla didn't hit its numbers.
Elon, part of the thing I heard about the Model 3 is that there's too many robots, that maybe...
Yeah, I agree.
You think so too? That maybe you need more people in here working?
We do.
Elon Musk abandoned the idea and admitted on Twitter, yes, excessive automation at Tesla was a mistake. To be precise, my mistake. Humans are underrated.
The turnover there is extremely bad because after a while, sometimes after even a few months, workers always already see how bad it is over there. Management didn't care about safety. It's just extremely exhausting, and they just realize that the pay is not worth it.
After 5 years of grueling hours and injuries, Dennis left for another job. He says his coworkers are still facing the same problems. Meanwhile, Elon Musk has become one of the world's richest men, worth an estimated $156 billion.
I want the culture to re-change, to feel less intimidating, less stress, more at equal levels, no more superiority complex over workers. I would want health and safety to be above production numbers. I want workers to just come into work every day knowing that their job's gonna be there the next day.
More fantastic work from More Perfect Union. And I just want to make sure everybody notices the pattern here, the connection here. Two richest men in the world are Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, okay? How do they treat their workers? Where's that wealth coming from? It's pretty obvious, right? It's really pretty obvious. It's stolen value from their workers. And those workers, you can steal value from your workers without abusing them to this degree, and yet they abuse them to this degree. So this, it's not necessarily surprising, but I think it's very worth pointing out, especially when the owners like Bezos and Musk attempt to portray themselves as, humanitarians on the issue, or some sort of, no, I'm not like all those rapacious business owners. Yes, you are. Elon will occasionally try to tweet something that he thinks is progressive, but actually reveals how draconian he is. And, This story, again, it's not really surprising, but we got to keep these narratives out there, you guys, because what does the mainstream press do? They don't tell you about this. And when they do, they frame it in a way that's like very sympathetic to big business owners and shareholders and banks. So, and this is also, there's a angle here to the connection to the media is part of the problem, not just in a direct sense, in the sense that like Bezos owns one of the most powerful papers in the world, in the Washington Post, certainly one of the most powerful papers in the country. It's even a little bit, there are implicit ways that, both explicit and implicit, I suppose, that these connections happen from advertising dollars. I mean, how much money does Amazon spend on cable news channels, you guys? How much money does Tesla spend on cable news channels? Well, that works in the same way that it does when Raytheon or Boeing does it, right? These military contractors are buying favorable coverage on military stories by spending money on cable news. I've pointed this out before, but why is Boeing advertising to you, you guys? Why is Raytheon advertising to you? Are you going to go buy a cruise missile? Can you afford a 747? It's insane. There's no logical. They're not marketing a product to a customer when they choose to advertise on cable news. They're buying favorable coverage. And a very similar dynamic happens with, although Amazon and Tesla have a product to advertise, I think the dynamic's very similar. I think they're both trying to sell a product and engage in, the reputation management and all that shit, and also trying to buy favorable and sympathetic coverage from these outlets. So there's a lot of connections and dynamics that lead the media to be very sympathetic to these characters. And some of those dynamics are quite explicit and obvious and out in the open, right? Financial connections, buying them off, advertising, etc. So, that's why you're not going to hear about this in the mainstream press. And that's why I am so complimentary of More Perfect Union for bringing this to the forefront, as they so often do. And we have a couple more, actually, from More Perfect Union. This one's rather short. This is about airport workers in Orlando who are grossly mistreated by major airlines. So we'll watch this clip and then come back and discuss.
Least respected workers at the airport. This is the busiest airport in Florida, which is the 6th busiest in the whole United States.
We're underpaid with no pay, sick pay, no retirement pay, and also no vacation pay. We actually have nothing, you could say. We all deserve a better life.
Who push the wheelchairs for American Airlines, United Airlines, Frontier, and Virgin Airways are workers who work for an outsourced firm, a subcontractor called Bags Incorporated. These workers make $7.98. The folks who take care of the baggage for Bags make not much more. And so they have been understaffed because people don't want to earn that anymore. They end up having to push multiple wheelchairs. They started to get together to say, let's do something, and the company has responded with threats and intimidation.
The best solution to a workforce shortage is to pay your workers better. Right. It's not rocket science. Pay your workers better, and you will not only attract the best top talent, but you'll be able to retain them.
It's a place of hundreds of people are coming in and out. We are here to serve and do the best that we can and make sure that everyone are safe and happy with our job or what we do.
I get a day off. I don't have any sick leave. I don't have any vacation pay. That's un-American. I provide extra service to the people who cannot move around on their own, and that's very important.
It is now time for us to pay living wages to those persons who do so much for us.
We are grandfathers. We've seen people coming to this airport with their grandkids. I'm a grandfather. I love to bring my grandkids to go to Disney World. It costs a lot of money down there, and the wages I'm getting here, I just cannot afford it.
So again, fantastic to see that, you guys. It's not just Orlando. This was a whole a week of strikes for airport workers who cannot have a very good job. I mean, that's, you know, who likes being in an airport, right? And these people literally helping disabled people get around and get to the plane, get on their flight, etc. This, to mistreat them, and, you know, he says we're kind of the lowest of all the, we're, you know, looked down on as the lowest airport workers and stuff. This whole culture of stigmatizing low wage work and shaming people who do manual labor or do work that we consider unskilled, which is a horrible term anyway, but, you know, just the general stigmatization of workers, it needs to fucking stop. These are people doing a very necessary and beneficial service, and they ought to be compensated for it. They ought to be treated well and dignified for it, not stigmatized and looked down upon, and abused and undercompensated. So it's just encouraging to see the pushback here, you guys. You know, I don't know if people really realize how rapacious the airline industry is. Some of the worst companies in the country. I know we've kind of had a whole who's who of the worst companies of this show, haven't we? We've talked Amazon, we've talked Tesla, and, you know, I'm going to talk a little bit of Walmart later. We have a who's who of the worst companies in the country, but among them certainly American Airlines, United Airlines, Southwest Airlines, these Frontier, these big airlines, who lobby quite a bit with Congress because much of their industry does have like legal regulations to it, right? There are very strict laws about how you can behave on a plane and behave in an airport and stuff like this. So and you know, how airlines are able to go about pricing and price gouging and all this kind of stuff. There's regulations about all this stuff. So airlines spend quite a bit of money buying off Congress, right? Lobbying Congress. So they really are some of the worst companies out there. We also covered how during the pandemic, they waited until the first day. A bunch of major airlines, American was the one that caught the news story for it, but a whole bunch of major airlines did this. They waited until the day that they were allowed to, I'll take a step back. If they took a whole bunch of subsidies from the initial stimulus package, the agreement was you have to keep your workers on until X date, right? It's about a year ago. I think it was September of 2020 or something. Anyway, these airlines, they waited until the very day that they could lay off a bunch of their workers. Did it the first day they were allowed to. So they took a bunch of public dollars with the idea being you're taking this so that you can continue to pay your workers, to keep your workers on staff, to not have to lay off all your workers. And then the first day they laid off a whole bunch of their workers. And then when we had a dip in the pandemic and people wanted to fly and travel again, these airlines started canceling flights and complaining about a lack of labor. You see how on all these issues, they want it both ways. They want to fuck their worker over. And then the second the worker has any leverage at all to say, treat me better or I'm gone, they want to bitch and moan and throw a temper tantrum that they don't have access to cheap labor. On every single angle, they are wrong. The first day they do the wrong thing. They do the rapacious and greedy thing. The very first day they're allowed to, they do it. And it's because they know they bought off Congress. They're not going to face any repercussions for it. So I just want to point out, airline industry, absolutely terrible. And I'm encouraged to see these workers pushing back across the country. Airport workers, very much abused and exploited. And I hope to see them have some success in those efforts. And we have one more for you. This is also more perfect union. This is workers at Disneyland pushing back on how Disney treats them, another major company that's quite exploitative and rapacious. We'll watch this clip and then come back and finish out the discussion on labor stuff.
In Disneyland, you see janitors, cast members die, living in their cars or living because they don't have homes. And that's the story that they don't want to tell, because that goes against the happiest place on earth.
It is immoral. Yes, sir. It should be illegal to take full-time people, give them less, and part-time people and give them nothing.
Disneyland Corporation got over $500 million of CARES money and laid off 28,000 workers, many of them that did not have a dime, many of them that have not been brought back to work.
Yo estoy atrasada 4 meses con mi mortgage y tengo miedo de perder mi condominio que me costó mucho trabajo con el propósito para mis hijos.
They are using this opportunity in this pandemic to actually get rid of workers and to get rid of workers who might have had some kind of disability or workers who have a seniority that they feel that they would have to pay them a little bit more than a brand new worker.
And we're also dealing with the fact that they don't want to give us seniority pay. So now we have people who've been working 15, 20 years making the same as somebody who's brand new.
Yo me siento muy orgullosa de los visitantes que me han dado las gracias cuando me han encontrado limpiando un basurero y ven el parque muy limpio y ellos dicen gracias por tener muy limpio el parque. Nosotros merecemos el pago que sea suficiente para sobrevivir.
What's going on is basically a joke. Disney has a joke of an offer on wages, no recognition for senior cast members that have been here for 20 years or more. I know some are 30 and are getting the same wages as people that just started. Minimal wage increases, less than 3% for most of them. No increase in some of the premiums. No increase in paid days off for the part-time members. It's a real joke what they're offering. What do we say to that? Okay.
Brothers and sisters, we stand with you. When I say union, you say power. Union! 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 Union!
Again, absolutely fantastic work here, and again, an inspirational and heartwarming story that these workers are fighting and fighting for each other and themselves. The only slight objection I have to that last one, you guys, I hate to criticize More Perfect Union, but the CARES Act is not taxpayer dollars, and it makes me want to pull my fucking hair out when I see like fantastic organizations, lefties who I support, etc., using the term taxpayer dollars to describe federal spending. Please don't do that. Please. It's public dollars or federal spending. Okay. It is not taxpayer dollars. If you don't understand what I'm talking about, go read The Deficit Myth by Stephanie Kelton and read up on MMT. It's a lot of what we do here at Real Progressives. You can go to realprogressives.org for all sorts of educational content on MMT and other issues as well. But please do not refer to federal spending as taxpayer dollars. It basically gives home field away to the neoliberals when it comes to discussing any sort of socioeconomic spending. And we cannot do that. We cannot afford to do that. Okay. So that's my one little critique of More Perfect Union. If they ever happen to see my show, please don't use taxpayer dollars when you're describing federal spending, please. But other than that, fantastic work here. And Disney, again, another major media outlet and humongous company that mistreats its workers and has for a very long time. Walt Disney, pretty famously not a great dude. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, just Google Walt Disney. Maybe Google the word anti-Semitism with it if you just need a hint. Not a great company, not a great history. And I'm glad to see these workers, pushing back against the rapacious conduct of their corporate overlords. So nice long segment here on worker stuff today, you guys. I really love to bring you this content because I think we need to be reminded that we can win. It gets so pessimistic on the left. I get very nihilistic about politics. I'm guilty of that. And sometimes I kind of view my role as just like telling everyone how bad it is. So it's when we have a story like this that inspires people to take action, that provides an avenue for us to actually achieve some of the things that we feel so strongly about. I really want to take the time to highlight that, because it's important for us to remember, you guys, that we do have the power. I know it's so easy to say that, and it's so hard to actually organize people and get people on the same page, especially on the left, where we seem to just chew each other up over nonsense a lot. But you know what? We do have the power. Workers do have the power. And if we can come together around these kinds of stories and find inspiration and hope and motivation in these kinds of stories, I think we can actually start to chip away at some of the power held by the very few. So huge shout out to More Perfect Union. Once again, for like the fourth time, I'll plug them. Please go follow them if you're not already following them. Get involved in local labor organizing if you see it around you. Don't cross the picket line. If there's a strike going on, don't cross the picket line. Support those workers. If there are protests or walkouts or unionization efforts going on, do what you can to support those workers. I just can't say enough about this, you guys. This is what really, protests and demonstrations are great, you know. Voting for decent candidates, it's good. It's a tool. Do it. I'm not saying stop, but this is where you can really fucking hit them, is when you start to hit their pocketbooks and when you start to take away their capacity to rake in the profits that they, garner from exploiting workers. So humongous shout out to More Perfect Union. Humongous shout out to the airport workers, to the Amazon workers, to the Tesla workers, to the Disney workers. Any worker out there who is currently striking or walking out or pushing their boss, or bosses or owners to treat them better. This is where this is the heart of the movement, you guys. It really is the heart of the movement, is labor organizing. So, really want to encourage everybody to get involved and support the movement wherever they can. So we have a story here. This is a couple weeks old, but I really felt like I needed to cover it. I obviously missed last week, unfortunately. This is about the sort of, I think, misleading way, to put it mildly, that the media has reported on so-called inflation lately. This is in the Wall Street Journal, believe it or not. And it reveals how major U.S. corporations are essentially taking advantage of the supply chain issues to price gouge further and, enrich themselves further, which is exactly what they do in every scenario. So it shouldn't be surprising, should it? Anyhow, what does inflation mean for American business? For some, bigger profits. Nearly 2 out of 3 of the biggest U.S. publicly traded companies reported fatter profit margins than they did before the pandemic, a very unprecedented environment. Oh, geez. I'm sorry, you guys. We'll just read the first paragraph here. Companies are paying higher wages, spending more for materials, and absorbing record freight costs, pushing up economic inflation gauges. They are also reporting some of their best profitability in years. Obviously, I'm not subscribed to the Wall Street Journal. I saw this reported on another outlet and thought that I could read you the article. Here's what it boils down to. Corporate executives in major grocery chains like Kroger and Walmart are bragging to investors about how they are using the supply chain issues that are inflating prices to further gouge their own customers. So normally, if I went to the store and an item that I'm used to buying seemed more expensive, I would probably go to another local store and find it cheaper, right? But in this environment, because the media has so misreported the so-called inflation, and I want to make really clear, you guys, it's really not true inflation. It's a supply chain issue. So it's not, they want to frame it as though it's a demand side thing, and it's just, inflation often is not a demand side thing to start with, but that's its own topic. This is not an issue of overspending. It's not. It's a supply chain issue, okay? So the media has misreported this to a degree that I think average citizens think that inflation is happening, which means when they go to the grocery store and they see everything up 5 or 10%, they're expecting that. So they're not going to go to the other store across town and find it cheaper. They accept that price is what it is. So these corporations have recognized this and used it to spike prices even more than the supply chain issues demand that they spike their prices to maintain their profit margin, right? So it's further greed, it's further rapaciousness. And the way that I think it was the Kroger CEO put it to investors while he was bragging about it on a call was something like, we have passed more than the cost along to the customer. In other words, we're exploiting this to bring in more profits. Well, guess what? That actually is inflationary. So not only will the media not report on this, although to be fair, the Wall Street Journal did cover it, but you didn't see a whole lot of coverage of it, and you see it largely misframed, right? Not only will the mainstream media continue to misframe this, they'll also continue to blame everyday people for getting a freaking $1,200 check 9 months ago or whatever. You know, it's just one of these stories where it is so backwards how this narrative has formulated compared to reality. So big business here is creating the very problem that they're trying to blame workers for and everyday people for and the impoverished people for, right? Notice how it's never the powerful's fault when things go wrong, even though they have the power to dictate how things go. It's never their fault. It's always some totally powerless, impoverished person who voted the wrong way or who took a $1,200 stimmy check. That's who to blame for all of our fucking problems, right? It's actually confounding to me that we don't have a populace that can see through that more often than they do. Seems to me to be an inherently false claim to constantly blame all of our problems on the least powerful people in our society. Like, they literally don't have the leverage to do a thing about it, and you're going to blame them. Notice it's never inflationary when billionaires double their fucking wealth in like a year during a pandemic while everyone else struggles. That kind of wealth acquisition is never considered inflationary. There's never any worries about that causing a problem. It's always fucking Jimmy making $25,000 a year who took his $1,200 check. That's the problem, right? Anyway, apologies for the article situation there, guys, but that's I hope I kind of summed up the gist of it, and you know, got to the point there that corporations are exploiting these supply chain issues to rake in larger profits and then turning around and blaming the least powerful people in our society. So we have a rather funny story here. This one's just a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but I felt the need to cover it. And I hate giving the woman any more attention than is warranted, but it would just, this was so fucking funny. This is unfortunately in the Daily Mail, but that's the only place I could find it. Hillary Clinton says, ordinary Americans just don't understand President Biden's extraordinary accomplishments. So there is so much to say here. I mean, first of all, it's just flat out wrong. He has not accomplished the vast majority of the promises that he made, many of which, you guys, by the way, don't even require Congress. So he hasn't even done by executive order many of the things that he promised to do and to prioritize, like student debt, wiping away student debt, tuition-free college. He could do Medicare for all, or he promised a public option. He's never supported Medicare for all. He could do a public option by executive order using the Social Security Act to declare an emergency with the pandemic, and he could implement Medicare for all via EO. It would take a signature on a piece of paper, and he hasn't done it. All of these promises he lets fall flat. He lets the $15 an hour thing fall flat because the parliamentarian said so. And here Hillary wants to say, well, Americans just don't understand how great he's been. Are you fucking kidding me? So it's brazenly false from the get-go, right? People have not had their lives improved by Joe Biden's administration. They're not going to feel anything that he has done to any substantive degree, right? Just factually wrong in the first place. But the other point that this is what kind of stood out to me. Is there any more Clinton-esque form of voter outreach than you're just too stupid? Like, they think this is going to win people over? Her telling voters, you're just too fucking stupid to understand how great Biden has been, so vote for us in a year? I I can't even begin to understand how a human being could think that that's helpful. She is quite possibly, and I know we've been talking a lot about Kamala lately, who may have a claim on this by the time it's all said and done, but Hillary might be the least talented politician that I have ever seen in my life. Her lack of understanding how her words are going to come off to a voter base is incredible. The degree to which she is tone deaf to her own rhetoric is incredible. You're just stupid. If only you weren't stupid, you'd get it. So now vote for us. When is the last time that you sitting at home had someone tell you you're a moron and your first reflex was like, well, now I think more favorably of that person that just called me a moron? Does she honestly think that this is how psychology goes? Does she honestly think this is helpful to the party? Or quite frankly, just to take the cynical angle momentarily, is she just so jealous of Biden that she's trying to tank his reputation? Is she so petty and cynical that she's just trying to tank his reputation because she's so fucking jealous that he's sitting in the White House and she couldn't beat Trump? And by the way, she couldn't beat Trump because of the very same shit that she's now doing, right? You remember the deplorables comment? That's the same attitude as this. You just don't get all the fantastic things that Joe's done. Oh, God, I saw that quote and it was just, it makes me want to laugh and cry at the same time. You know what I mean? Like, oh. But the other point is, and this is why I didn't want to cover this, but I felt like I had to. Why is Hillary Clinton still relevant, you guys? Why is it that in politics, it seems to be the only industry where we treat people who have repeatedly miserably failed as though there's some sort of authority on the topic? People who've gotten nothing right for decades, we treat as though they're somehow experts, and we platform and prop up there to spew their fucking opinions. It's the only industry I know where that's the case. So why are we still listening to the woman who couldn't beat Donald motherfucking Trump? Why do outlets still turn to her for sound bites and quotes about what's going on in politics? It's the only industry where you can spend your whole career being wrong, miserably failing, committing war crimes, disgusting commentary, racist commentary, all this shit that she and Bill engaged in, and you still somehow are treated as an authority on the topic. It's outrageous. It's really it's a condemnation of our society and our media environment and a lot of the cultural elements of our society. So I just felt the need to touch on that. I know it's kind of a tongue-in-cheek issue, but Hillary tells voters they're too fucking stupid and expects them to vote for her because of it, or vote for her party because of it. No, it's going to be, you guys, Democrats are going to get boat raced next year. Absolutely boat raced. They're going to lose both chambers almost certainly. And then in 2024, they're very likely to lose the White House. So if you think this is good politics, I got a bridge in Brooklyn to sell you, and perhaps Hillary would buy it. So another story here that goes back a little ways, but that I have tried to keep up on as best as I can is Andrew Cuomo's innumerable instances of corruption and scandals and sexual harassment and abuse and all this stuff. This is in Politico, and it pertains to the book he wrote during the pandemic. So while he was fucking the pandemic up every which way to Sunday and lying about nursing home COVID rates and leaving thousands of old people open to infection unnecessarily, and all these horrible, in my view, criminal behaviors that Andrew Cuomo engaged in. All the while, he was misusing state funds to force his staff to write his book, in which it was a book to brag about himself as a leader. It was self-aggrandizing piffle, in which he completely misrepresented his handling of the pandemic and then asked people for credit and praise over said mishandling of the pandemic. So we're going to get into some of the details that have come out in the last couple of weeks here. This, again, is Politico. Cuomo impeachment probe bolsters claims on book deal, sexual harassment, and nursing homes. Oh, excuse me. The New York State Assembly's report on its 8-month impeachment investigation supports many of the allegations that have surfaced about former Governor Andrew Cuomo and provides fresh insight into his use of state resources to clinch a $5 million book deal amid the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. Just a quick note that's kind of funny, you guys. He made a lot of money on this book because it was a $5 million deal, but no one bought it. So he got his cash and some publisher got fucked, but no one bought or read his book. And I think there's a little bit of justice in that, just a tiny bit. The report focuses on 3 of the major allegations made against the ex-governor in recent months who resigned in August amid the Assembly's probe and other investigations. The report, released Monday after a week of previews by Albany lawmakers, bolstered the findings of Attorney General Tish James's probe into allegations of sexual harassment, concluding that the former governor's challenges to the allegations cannot overcome the overwhelming evidence of his misconduct. It concludes that the Cuomo administration manipulated data on deaths of nursing home residents during the pandemic with the goal of combating criticisms over his decision-making. And the report provides more details in its conclusion that Cuomo's memoir, American Crisis: Leadership Lessons from the COVID-19 Pandemic, relied on the use of state staff who did not volunteer their time. The Assembly is not expected to turn its probe, which started in March, into the basis for a post-resignation impeachment of Cuomo, but it says it plans to share its findings with law enforcement officials. So, I again think this is probably criminal, but that doesn't mean that there will actually be criminal consequences for his actions, right? It makes clear here that those who helped him write the book were not volunteering their personal time. They were on the clock and they were instructed to help him write this book that, again, manipulated numbers, lied about what happened, left major portions of the story out, and then asked the public for credit and praise for his leadership. And this, the Cuomos in general are just awful. His brother Chris has mishandled the coverage of all of this and then tried to hide behind the personal relationship. So he had no problem. He had Andrew on his show almost every goddamn day for weeks. During the Trump presidency, when the whole media was going apeshit about Andrew Cuomo and treating him like he was the fucking, second president or something like that. Chris had no problem bringing him on his show to joke about his big nose and all this shit, right? Prop him up as some sort of great leader and all that. And it was pretty obvious at the time that Andrew wanted to run for president and that they were all engaging in this, propping his name up. And I'm sure that the book had something to do with wanting to run for president and all that, right? Anyway, Chris then comes out when all these sexual harassment claims came forth and the manipulation of nursing home data came forth. Chris then says, well, I'm too close to it to cover, and it wouldn't be good journalistic ethics if I were to cover my brother. So he wants it both ways, right? Now, if you took that position from the start, I actually would be relatively sympathetic to it. If you said from the start, when everything was great for Andrew, if you said, I'm not touching it, I'm not platforming him, I'm not going to talk about him, he's my brother, then you would at least be consistent when you turned around and said, I'm also not going to cover the negative shit. But of course, that's not what Chris did. He violated, seriously, anyone who's taken journalism 101 knows that one of the first rules is not to do exactly what Chris did, right? To be biased about your coverage because of a personal connection. That's exactly what Chris did. And by the way, shame on CNN for even allowing him to do it, for continuing to provide a platform to somebody who engaged in that kind of journalistic malpractice. But this is another one of those stories that's just not terribly surprising, but obviously newsworthy. And it's a warning for journalists. When someone is being glorified universally in the press, you have no idea what's going to come out. So you need to just cover shit objectively and not participate in the clickbaity nonsense that most of the media participated in when Andrew Cuomo was deemed some sort of anti-Trump COVID hero. And there was no reason to deem him that in the first place. Even the manipulated numbers didn't look all that great for a while, you guys. Even his manipulated numbers didn't make New York look all that great. So he mishandled this about as bad as any governor did. Then he lied about it. Then he misused state resources to write a book bragging about his lies. This web of corruption and misconduct and objectively bad behavior continues. And I am hopeful, but not necessarily banking on Andrew Cuomo facing criminal charges for any number of offenses here. He could face criminal charges for the sexual harassment and assault allegations. He could face criminal charges for lying on state records. He could face criminal charges for or maybe not criminal. He could at least face lawsuits for, and maybe he already has, for leaving nursing home residents vulnerable to COVID-19 when they didn't need to be, and doing so by law, forcing them to be exposed to COVID-19 when they didn't need to be. There are a number of things Cuomo has done that I think warrant some form of accountability. And I'm hopeful, but again, not naive enough to expect that accountability will occur. So we have a couple more stories to get to here. This is about a refugee camp in a facility in Chicago and how they are mistreating Afghan children. This is in ProPublica.org. Dozens of traumatized Afghan kids struggle inside a shelter that's ill-equipped to care for them. Some Afghan children at a Chicago shelter have hurt themselves or others, leaving workers overwhelmed. Employees say the shelter has never experienced this level of chaos and isn't equipped to provide kids with services they need. And I just want to note before we dive into the details here, guys, let's look at this big picture. We create many of these refugees with our foreign policy, and then we refuse to take them. And when we do take them, we treat them like this. We are wrong on every possible angle of this issue. Okay. And to those conservatives that do not want to take refugees or have no problem with the mistreatment of refugees, how about you stop fucking creating them with your foreign policy? How about you stop killing people overseas for military profits, for profits for military contractors? How about that? I want to make sure that context is kind of overlaying this whole thing. Diving in here. Some children who were evacuated from Afghanistan and are being cared for at a Chicago shelter for immigrant minors have hurt themselves, harmed other children, or threatened staff. Others have tried to escape or talked about wanting to die. Some have required psychiatric hospitalization. These events at the shelter were described by 3 employees and other people familiar with the conditions there, as well as being detailed in police records and internal documents obtained by ProPublica. Employees at the shelter, which is operated by the nonprofit Heartland Alliance, say they are overwhelmed and ill-equipped to care for the roughly 40 Afghan children and teens placed there by the U.S. government, many of them traumatized by war in their homeland and their hasty evacuation. The employees said they have never experienced this level of disorganization or stress, even though some of them worked through the chaos inside Heartland shelters following the Trump administration's zero-tolerance immigration policy of separating children from their parents. Language and cultural barriers have exacerbated the problem. Workers said no employees speak Pashto or Dari, the children's main languages, and access to phone-based interpretation lines is limited, making it difficult to de-escalate tense encounters. So there's a number of angles to take here, you guys. First of all, the big picture stuff I mentioned. This is a bipartisan thing. We create refugees with our egregious, offensive, aggressive, imperialistic foreign policy. And we do so for the profits of Boeing and Raytheon and General Dynamics. And then when those refugees on the rare occasions that we accept those refugees, we severely mistreat them. This has a lot of angles. This gets to border stuff, right? And people seeking amnesty. And it also sort of ties in with the prison system and just in general how we treat people who are being held in any sort of way. But it also, there's the political implications too here, where, like, I'm sure many of you remember the Democrats in 2016 who said, well, you have to vote for Hillary because otherwise we're going to be mistreating refugees and immigrants, right? Well, where's all that hand-wringing now? Where's all the upset liberals about kids in cages now? Nothing has changed, you guys. We're almost a year into the Biden administration. There's still an absolute catastrophe going on at the border, okay? And now we find out that we're also mistreating Afghan refugees after Biden wants credit for the evacuation that was undertaken in Afghanistan months ago. How do we treat the people we evacuated? This is outrageous, you guys. It's absolutely outrageous. And it also brings in to focus the extent to which this kind of demagoguery is weaponized politically by both parties. They love playing the culture war of all of this during election season, fear-mongering about the other side during election season, in largely entirely disingenuous ways. And then when it comes to actually caring for the kids whose lives they are all too happy to cynically weaponize, they always fall flat. They always neglect to even try. So, and I want to point out, this story is one specific story. It's very likely an anecdotal version of what is going on broadly around the country at these camps and at these facilities. So shame on us, and shame on those who will, pose as though they're upset about this based upon partisanship. Shame on you. Shame on the Biden administration. Shame on anybody who chooses not to put resources into these facilities. Shame on anybody who will politically and cynically weaponize this issue for their own electoral gains and then ignore it for a couple of years until the next election. And shame on anybody who pushes for the aggressive foreign policy, who props up the military-industrial complex as though it is somehow necessary or beneficial to anybody. This is an outrageous story, and this is something we need to redirect focus to, despite the fact that there's a Democratic administration. Okay, this is another thing to go back to that Hillary story. Is this his fantastic accomplishment, Hillary? Is this what you were talking about when you said, "Oh, Jesus fucking Christ"? Anyhow. And one last little story here, you guys. This is David Sirota tweeted this out, and I don't know how many of you saw this, but it's already very let them eat cake for a president to hang at a billionaire's Nantucket pad. But it's some real Gilded Age shit when the billionaire's private equity firm has all sorts of interests before the government right now. So Carlyle Group co-founder David Rubenstein is a multi-billionaire. Biden went and hung out at his place last weekend. Now, Rubenstein has all sorts of interests currently being negotiated and debated by the federal government. So it's, as David says, it's not just a horrible optic. It's not just the let them eat cake thing for him to go spend a weekend there while people are kicked off unemployment, struggling coming into the holidays, etc. It's also pretty brazen corruption. You don't think Rubenstein is going to talk, try and get in his ear about some of those issues? I mean, please. So Democrats love to try to say that they're in favor of getting money out of politics and, these big, bad, corrupt Republicans, and then they go hang out with Carlyle Group co-founders. It reveals either a complete ignorance and stupidity when it comes to optics. It either reveals that they are so in their bubble, so exclusively interacting with the political and financial elite, that they just think this is normal, or it shows that they don't give a fuck. That the real reason that they want power is simply for the sake of power, or some combination of the two, obviously. But if you really want to win re-election, if you really care about your party succeeding, you wouldn't do this kind of shit, you guys. So that's the one part of this that is somewhat like confusing and befuddling to me about some of the conduct of Democrats, is that they seem to just be totally, I don't know, indifferent to the next election. They don't seem to care how their actions are going to impact their future electoral success. And perhaps they really just don't. Maybe they're just openly playing gatekeeper for Republicans. Maybe they're just there to openly shut down the left. But if you really want to have any electoral success, if you're serious about any of your policy agenda, which requires you to harbor power, then you wouldn't do this kind of shit. You wouldn't have Pelosi officiating a fucking oil baron's child's wedding if they actually gave a fuck about winning re-election or having any electoral success in 2022. But you can bet that when they shit the bed in next November, in about a year, there'll be plenty of finger pointing at the progressives, right? You can bet your whole life savings on it. You can bet your life on it. That will be the narrative. So Biden here continuing the age-old tradition of American presidents being corrupt as all hell and not caring how brazen and obvious and open they are about said corruption. And, you know, for this, just it again goes against that Hillary narrative of like, is this what you're talking about when you say his great accomplishments? What, groveling to the Carlyle Group? Is this what you were fucking talking about, Hillary? Insanity. Utter insanity. Want to once again encourage everybody to go to realprogressives.org. You guys, if you can donate, we are a nonprofit. We do all sorts of activism and organizing and media and education. We are working on a number of exciting projects, including, I will tease, a new segment on this show that you can catch next week. So make sure to tune in to next week's show. But if you can donate, if you're interested in reading articles on economics and politics, educational and political content, go to realprogressives.org. Make sure you don't miss the Macro and Cheese podcast. Our founder and CEO, Steve Grumbine. That podcast drops on Saturday mornings. All sorts of fantastic information there. Don't miss MMT Mondays. One will be on tomorrow night on Real Progress in Action. That's with our co-editor-in-chief, Jabari Morris, going over previous clips about economics and putting it in context. It's a great series as well. And yeah, just don't miss any of our content. Make sure you're following both of our YouTube pages, Real Progressives and Real Progress in Action. Twitter is at Real Progress US, at RP_in_action. And I am at Luke Parcher Show if you care to follow me. With that, have a wonderful week. And I will see you all next Sunday at 2 Eastern and 11 Pacific. You can catch me live every Sunday, same time. Make sure not to miss it. Again, great new segment coming up next week. So don't forget to tune in. Hope everybody has a fantastic week. And I will see you all next Sunday.